There are tales buried in Tennessee's hillsides that no preacher dared speak aloud. Legends of men who twisted kinship into something monstrous. In one remote county, brothers didn't just live beneath their father's command. They became bound to him in the most forbidden way, not only as sons, but as husbands of blood. This wasn't the kind of history carved into courthouse walls or preserved in proud family Bibles. It was a secret smothered in silence, as though the smoke of shame itself might blot it from memory. And yet, shadows have a way of seeping back. Old cabins still whisper, graveyards still echo, and whispers of broken bloodlines linger like rot in the rafters. Tonight, we reopen one of the darkest folk tales whispered in the American South, the sons who married their father. Before we step deeper into the shadows, make sure you subscribe, drop a like, and share this story. It helps bring forgotten legends like this one back into the light. In Tennessee's forgotten hills, stories were carried not in books, but in whispers among old men seated on porches. Cigarette smoke curled into the night, and their voices trembled with secrets too heavy for daylight. The tale they carried was not of progress or triumph, but of rot. A story that made strong men avert their eyes, clutch their bottles tighter, and mutter prayers under their breath. They spoke of a father whose shadow stretched across his land like a prison wall. His sons, trapped beneath him, were not only heirs but instruments of his will, reshaped against all nature. The whispers said the cabin stood alone, perched near a dark river that devoured the moonlight. Windows were boarded not to keep intruders out, but to keep secrets penned inside, rotting behind wood and stone. This was not the kind of legend that towns recorded with pride. No courthouse papers, no family Bibles, only broken men, remembering what they'd heard from their fathers before them, each retelling dipped in shame. The curse began with the father himself. He believed blood was a chain, something to twist, not honor. His grip on his sons was absolute, and no preacher nor sheriff dared intervene. Isolation was his ally. The cabin sat miles from the nearest chapel. Crops barely grew, neighbors never lingered. In that silence, his commands reigned supreme, a law stronger than any statute carved by man. They said the father's temper was iron. His eyes were cold, his voice sharper than any blade. His sons obeyed not out of love, but out of fear that blistered deeper than fire. When his own companion vanished, whether through death or disappearance, he did not seek another outside. Instead, he turned inward. His sons filled the void, bound not by choice, but by a father's twisted decree. At first, the town looked away. Mountain men were known for hard ways, and rumors were dismissed as exaggerations. But whispers grew louder, and signs emerged that no amount of silence could erase. The sons began bearing children, sons of sons, tangled in lineage too close for comfort. Their faces carried mirrored features, jaws too familiar, eyes repeating themselves until they seemed more reflections than individuals. Old accounts claimed some boys were scarcely 15 when their father began treating them as husbands. It was never about affection. It was obedience turned into bondage, loyalty warped into an unbearable burden. To leave meant starvation. To resist meant violence. In those mountains, survival depended on land, food, and shelter, all controlled by the father. Sons remained, shackled not only by blood, but by necessity. Farmers passing the cabin averted their eyes. Men on horseback whispered curses under their breath, yet none intervened. Perhaps fear silenced them, perhaps cowardice. Either way, the sons remained prisoners of blood. As the years turned, the family became a living curse. Children of children stumbled through the woods, frail and hollow. Some bore crooked spines, others minds that never grew beyond infancy. At night, travelers claimed to see the sons themselves, vacant eyes, torn clothes, wandering as though unsure of who they were. Sons, husbands, fathers, brothers, their identities collapsed beneath the weight of twisted lineage. And in the heart of it all, the father stood, rifle slung, eyes sharp, daring anyone to trespass. His cabin became a fortress of rot, where silence itself was his most powerful weapon. The story survived not through records, but through whispers, each man passing it down like a curse, warning his sons, "Beware the silence of the hills, for within it horrors take root unchecked." The cabin stood like a scar upon the hillside, its timbers blackened by smoke and storms. Inside, no laughter echoed, only the heavy breathing of men who had forgotten freedom long ago. Every corner smelled of mildew, sweat, and old firewood. The air hung thick, pressing down upon the sons who lived there, their eyes hollow, their shoulders bent beneath burdens too unnatural to name. The father ruled as monarch, preacher, and judge. His word was not questioned, it was law. When he spoke, the sons lowered their heads, too afraid to resist, too trapped to escape. He demanded loyalty not through kindness, but through terror. The sons knew his fists, his belt, and worse still, his silence. To disappoint him was to vanish from the house entirely, erased without mourning. In this world, men lived not as kin, but as property. Each son was an extension of the father's will, stripped of choice, reshaped into tools that obeyed the twisted order of blood. The nights were worst. Behind closed shutters, roles blurred. Sons became more than heirs. They were twisted into husbands by force. The cabin walls heard cries no outsider ever dared to acknowledge. By day, the sons worked the thin soil, hacking at earth that yielded little. Sweat dripped, backs broke, yet no harvest could free them. Every seed sown belonged still to the father's hand. Neighbors avoided the ridge. Men riding past would tip their hats, eyes fixed on the road ahead. They whispered to each other, yet none dared confront the fortress where the father reigned. The cabin grew strange rituals. The father preached his own scripture, twisting words to justify dominion. Sons sat silent, nodding at verses reshaped into chains, each sermon hammering their obedience deeper into the bone. Some sons bore children, though the air around them seemed cursed. These boys emerged fragile, their features uncanny, their stares hollow. It was as if the blood itself revolted against what it had become. The father buried those who died in the night. Small, unmarked graves stretched behind the cabin. He shoveled earth with hands steady, unflinching, as though planting proof of his own corruption beneath the soil. The surviving boys grew beneath his iron shadow. They worked, ate, slept, and suffered according to his command. No outside world reached them. Their entire universe existed within those rotting wooden walls. Silence became their cage. The hills echoed with wind and owls, but within the cabin there was no sound save the father's voice. Even whispers among brothers risked punishment too great to bear. Stories say the eldest son once tried to run. His body was found days later in the river, swollen and pale. Men shook their heads but spoke nothing aloud, fearing reprisal. The younger brothers learned quickly. Defiance ended in graves. Obedience meant survival. And so they stayed, eyes down, hearts shackled, until even the idea of freedom felt like a dream fading from memory. This house of men did not resemble kinship. It was a kingdom where bloodlines folded inward, twisting love into ownership, duty into captivity. Each son lived as both heir and prisoner simultaneously. The father's reign transformed the cabin into something less than a home, more than a prison. It was a shrine to control, a place where blood itself became both the law and the punishment. In the hills, people muttered of curses. But the truth was simpler. This was not magic. This was a house of men bound by silence, ruled by fear, consumed by the shadow of one. The deeper one looks into this legend, the clearer it becomes that kinship was not preserved but shattered. The father did not see sons as children, but as vessels, reshaped into something unrecognizable. Ordinary households in the hills spoke of honor, duty, and hard labor. Yet in this cabin, the father inverted every rule. His sons were not raised to stand apart, but forced to collapse together. The bond between brothers should have been sacred, a shield against hardship. But under the father's command, it was twisted. Brotherhood became blurred into roles no scripture or tradition could ever justify. Old men said the father spoke with certainty, declaring his order as destiny. He claimed blood was stronger when folded inward, as though tightening the knot of lineage would grant strength instead of ruin. The sons obeyed, not because they believed, but because they had no choice. Their every breath belonged to him. Their lives were bent into shapes that defied both nature and God alike. When boys should have been running through fields, they were pressed into roles of men, too early, too grotesque. Their laughter died before it could echo, replaced by silence heavy as chains. As the father's rule continued, distinctions collapsed. The titles of son, husband, and brother merged until they meant nothing. Each boy became both heir and partner, trapped in an endless circle of obedience. Legends describe nights when hymns were sung in strange harmony, voices of men echoing beneath timber beams. These songs were not of praise, but of survival, rehearsed scripts masking the horror they endured. Travelers claimed to hear those voices from the woods, uneasy notes trembling in the dark. It was music stretched thin, voices cracked and weary, men trying to make sense of captivity disguised as worship. In time, the bond turned darker still. Sons bore sons who were also grandsons, brothers who were also nephews. Words lost meaning, bloodlines coiled in on themselves until the family tree became a knot. These new boys carried signs of decay. Some limped with crooked legs, others stammered, their eyes dull as river stones. Nature itself seemed to rebel against the father's arrangement, punishing defiance with weakness. Still, the father held firm. He walked with his rifle, patrolling the land, daring anyone to question his world. His grip was unshakable, his dominion as absolute as iron forged in fire. The brothers never spoke aloud of what they endured. Silence was their shield, their curse, and their doom. Without words, there could be no rebellion, only the hollow rhythm of continued survival. What bound them together was not affection, but fear. Fear of the father's wrath, fear of the hill's isolation, fear of starvation beyond those rotten cabin walls. Every choice narrowed until none remained. And yet deep inside, the forbidden bond carried cracks. Some sons were said to stare at the horizon, eyes burning with something unspoken. A yearning for freedom battled against the weight of obedience, but the horizon was far, and the father's shadow closer. Each attempt at defiance ended in silence, a body gone missing, a grave dug quick, and the whispers of men who dared not intervene. Thus the bond, though forbidden, endured. Twisted roles became routine, routine became tradition, and tradition became curse. The father succeeded in reshaping kinship into captivity, leaving behind a legacy more terrifying than any ghost. This was no ordinary story of hardship. It was proof that when power goes unchecked, even the strongest bonds among men can be twisted into prisons. The forbidden bond became legend, carved in whispers alone. The transformation from son to husband was never natural. It was a role forced upon the boys by the father, who believed bloodlines should fold inward. What should have been kinship became a prison. In ordinary households, sons grew into men by carving their own path. Here, the father denied them that right. He claimed ownership not just of their labor, but of their very manhood. The sons were bound to him in ways no outsider could understand. Nights in the cabin blurred every distinction. Sons who should have been heirs instead became unwilling partners, locked into roles they never chose. Old men said the father justified it through twisted scripture. He preached obedience as holy law, reshaping verses to declare that a son's duty was not only to honor, but to become one with him. The sons listened in silence, knowing resistance brought punishment. The father's voice echoed like thunder, hammering his command deeper with each sermon, until even their sense of self fractured under the weight of expectation. Travelers who passed through the hills claimed to sense unease. They spoke of shuttered windows, of men staring blankly from doorways, eyes dulled, shoulders bent, as though carrying burdens too heavy for ordinary backs. The role of husband robbed the sons of identity. They were neither free men nor simple heirs. They lived in confusion, every bond twisted into something grotesque, every title blurred until meaning dissolved entirely. Whispers grew about children born of this arrangement, sons raised by sons, nephews who were also brothers, grandsons who were also sons. Each generation tangled further, the bloodline collapsing inward like a knot pulled tight. These children bore scars of origin. Some grew frail, unable to walk without stumbling. Others spoke haltingly, their minds clouded. The hills whispered of a curse, though the truth was human cruelty, not supernatural wrath. The father buried the weakest quickly, earth turned beneath the cover of night. No markers were placed, only unmarked mounds behind the cabin testified to the cost of his obsession with control and dominance. Yet the arrangement endured. Sons became husbands because survival demanded it. To flee was death. To resist was destruction. The cabin walls trapped them, their very lives consumed by the father's endless dominion. By day, they chopped wood, tended the rocky soil, and hauled water from the river. By night, they served roles unspoken, performing duties demanded by a man who believed himself above natural law. This cycle reshaped generations. The cabin no longer held sons, it held prisoners. Men stripped of choice, reshaped into shadows of themselves, forced to play roles that shattered the meaning of kinship entirely. Neighbors avoided the property. They whispered of the strange household where brothers lived not as brothers, but as something darker. Yet still, none intervened, for fear of the rifle guarding the ridge. In the silence of those hills, obedience became tradition. What began as horror calcified into routine. The sons no longer questioned their roles. They simply existed, breathing beneath the father's shadow, hollow and resigned. The title of husband, once sacred in ordinary lives, became grotesque here. It bound the sons to their captor, not in partnership, but in chains. Each carried scars too deep for outsiders to see. And so the cabin remained a monument to control. Sons, twisted into husbands, endured generation after generation. Their suffering became folklore. Their silence became legend. And their story became the darkest echo of the hills. The curse of sons as husbands lingered, not in ghostly apparitions, but in the hollow eyes of descendants. Proof that once kinship is broken, even time itself struggles to mend what has been destroyed. The children born within that cabin were not ordinary boys. They entered the world already carrying the weight of a twisted lineage, their bloodlines folding in upon themselves like timber collapsing under rot. Each boy was both grandson and son, both brother and nephew. The words lost meaning. Kinship, once a map of belonging, was reduced to circles and repetitions until every title collapsed into confusion. Some children bore the burden in their bodies. Bent spines, shortened limbs, and frail lungs marked them from birth. They struggled to breathe, stumbled when walking, and often never survived the harsh Tennessee winters. Others carried scars in their minds. They stared blankly, their eyes vacant, unable to speak with clarity. Their thoughts drifted, their words stumbled. These sons seemed trapped in worlds too small to escape. The father buried them without ceremony. Under cover of darkness, he dug shallow graves behind the cabin, each mound a reminder of his dominion. No markers, no prayers, just silence pressed into the soil. Neighbors whispered about the unmarked graves. Men passing on horseback caught glimpses of fresh earth, sometimes still damp from rain. Yet none asked questions. Fear of the father's rifle kept lips tightly sealed. The surviving children grew into shadows of themselves, their features mirrored too closely, as though carved from the same mold. Jaw lines repeated, eyes identical, until each boy seemed less individual, more reflection of another. Travelers spoke of catching sight of them in the woods. Pale, thin boys with hollow stares, moving awkwardly as though the ground itself resisted their steps. Their presence unsettled even hardened mountain men. Inside the cabin, childhood never existed. From the moment they could stand, the boys were absorbed into the father's order. They chopped wood, hauled water, and bent their backs under endless labor. But the curse of bloodline did not only weaken bodies, it shattered identities. A boy raised by his own brother, a son disciplined by his grandfather who was also his father. Confusion swallowed them whole. Some of these children attempted to flee. Stories tell of boys wandering to nearby chapels, begging food from strangers. Their voices were halting, their eyes darting, their very presence unsettling to those who saw them. Yet many vanished. Some were whispered to have perished in the woods, others buried in the night. Silence consumed their fates. The hills held their secrets, and the cabin swallowed the rest. As generations folded inward, the bloodline weakened further. Each cycle seemed to produce sons more fragile than the last. It was as if nature itself rejected the father's attempt to defy its order. Still, the cabin endured. The father ruled, his sons obeyed, and the children bore the marks of both. It was a cycle not of growth, but of collapse, repeated until collapse itself became tradition. Folklore remembered the children less as individuals and more as omens. Men told their sons never to wander near the ridge, warning that cursed blood carried shadows that clung to anyone too curious. The graves multiplied quietly. Behind the cabin, rows of unmarked earth became a silent ledger of what the bloodline had cost. Each boy buried was a chapter closed, erased from memory by silence. Those who survived carried the heaviest burden. Their hollow stares haunted the hills, reminders that kinship had been broken, lineage corrupted. They were living proof that silence can become as deadly as any rifle. Thus the children of the bloodline became legend. Not through pride, not through honor, but through fear. Their existence carved a scar across Tennessee folklore, one that no passage of time could ever erase. The strangest part of this story is not just what happened inside the cabin, but how those outside reacted. Neighbors knew, preachers knew. Old men whispered, yet no one acted. The hills bred silence as much as they bred corn or tobacco. Men learned to keep their mouths shut, for speaking too loudly about another's house risked bullets, feuds, and blood spilled on porches. Every man knew the father ruled with iron. His sons walked the ridge like shadows, their eyes hollow. And yet, when questions rose, mouths closed, and silence spread thicker than smoke. At church, sermons circled around sin and duty, but no preacher dared name what happened in the cabin. They condemned whiskey, theft, and gambling, but never the corruption festering among their own. It wasn't ignorance. It was a decision. To speak aloud was to invite scandal, violence, and shame upon the entire county. Easier to bow heads and pretend nothing stirred in the woods. Traveling salesmen spread whispers across towns. They spoke of boys with identical faces, men with blank stares, graves behind a cabin. But the stories were dismissed as mountain exaggerations, folklore too dark to believe. The silence protected the father. His rifle was one barrier, but the community's refusal to confront him was another. Together, they built a wall stronger than any stone, complicity forged from cowardice. Men passing the ridge crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. Yet none stopped, none interfered. Their avoidance was its own confession, proof that fear outweighed duty and cowardice outweighed courage. In this silence, the father thrived. He knew no one would intervene. His sons were prisoners, But his neighbors were accomplices. Their quiet granted him license. Their indifference sharpened the chains he wielded. Old men later admitted they heard cries from the woods at night. They noticed fresh mounds of dirt behind the cabin, but each time they chose the easier path, closing their mouths and turning away. The sons suffered not only from the father's hand, but from the silence of the hills. A silence so thick it suffocated hope, convincing them no help would ever come. Some boys wandered into town, begging food with halting speech. Men looked upon them with pity, yet turned them back. None offered shelter, none broke the cycle. Compassion bent beneath the weight of silence. That silence grew into legend. Stories became warnings passed from fathers to sons. "Don't wander near that ridge," they'd say. "Evil lives there, and the hills themselves protect it." But the evil was not supernatural. It was human, shielded by silence. Every man who looked away, every preacher who refused to speak, every neighbor who avoided the cabin, each became part of the curse. The hills echoed not with truth, but with omission. And omission is its own form of violence. By refusing to speak, the community gave the father exactly what he needed: unchecked dominion. Generations later, men still whispered about their silence. Some claimed it was fear of reprisal. Others said it was pride, an unwillingness to admit such darkness could fester within their own county. Regardless of reason, the result was the same. Silence bound the sons as tightly as their father did. It became another chain, invisible but unbreakable, passed down with every whispered retelling. And so, the silence of the hills became as infamous as the cabin itself, a reminder that when men close their mouths, cruelty thrives. In those mountains, silence was not weakness, it was complicity. The cabin on the ridge did not vanish with time. Its timbers rotted, its roof sagged. Yet the memory of what happened within those walls became folklore, whispered by men around firesides. Hunters spoke of strange lights in the woods, claiming they saw figures of boys drifting silently between trees. Some said the children of that bloodline still wandered, their hollow stares burning through the dark. Stories told of voices at night, high and broken, hymns sung off-key. Men swore the songs were not of praise but of captivity, echoes of sons trapped in roles they could never escape. The cabin itself became legend. They said its shutters never opened, its door always bolted, as though even the building refused to let outsiders see the horrors sealed within its frame. Traveling preachers spread rumors in neighboring counties. They spoke of bloodlines too close, of sons who were both brothers and husbands, of children buried too young. Each retelling blurred details, but the core remained. Some claimed the father himself lingered long after death, a ghost with a rifle, pacing the ridge, guarding his dominion. Men warned their sons never to climb that hill, lest they meet his shadow. Others believed the descendants still walked among them, men with identical faces, mirrored features, eyes carrying emptiness. They kept to themselves, avoiding town, silence clinging to them like a second skin. Whether ghostly or flesh, the family became myth. Farmers warned their sons not to stray near the ridge. Strangers were told the land was cursed, a place where nature itself rejected man. The tales grew darker with each generation. Some swore they saw boys in tattered clothes, barefoot in the snow, staring from tree lines. Others claimed the sound of digging echoed at midnight. Folklore turned the cabin into a warning. It became less about truth and more about fear, shaping the behavior of sons through whispered horror. "Obey," fathers would say, "or suffer the curse of the ridge." Yet even as stories stretched, kernels of truth remained. The repeated features, the unmarked graves, the cries in the night, all pieces too consistent to dismiss as mere invention of frightened men. The hills themselves seemed complicit. Mist clung to the ridge, trees bent unnaturally, animals avoided the clearing. Men whispered that nature remembered what happened there and marked the land with permanent unease. Campfire tales spread far beyond Tennessee. Peddlers carried the legend across states. Each retelling added flourishes, but the message remained the same. The cabin was not just cursed, it was a monument of fear. And fear is powerful. Fear shaped generations of boys, teaching them boundaries without explanation. They avoided the woods at night, not because they understood, but because the folklore carried more weight than law. The father's name was forgotten, but his legend lived on. He became a figure of dread, his rifle immortalized in whispers, his dominion remembered as though death itself could not erase his presence. Some believed the bloodline never ended. They spoke of sons in nearby hollows, their faces eerily familiar, their silence as deep as the graves behind the ridge. Folklore blurred, but fear endured. The cabin finally collapsed, swallowed by weeds and vines. Yet the land remained marked. Men passing still muttered prayers. Even ruins could not bury what had been done beneath that sagging roof. Thus folklore and fear became intertwined. The truth mattered less than the warning. Whether real or imagined, the story lingered, shaping the hills into a place where silence and shadows carried more weight than history. The father's death did not end the story. His shadow lingered long after his body decayed. The sons, conditioned by years of fear, carried forward the very chains that once bound them. Raised under domination, they knew no other way. When the father was gone, the eldest stepped into his role, perpetuating the cycle. Sons became rulers, and brothers became prisoners, repeating the curse endlessly. The bloodline itself was fractured. Each generation produced boys weaker than the last, fragile bodies, hollow stares, twisted features. It was as though nature rebelled against their lineage, carving scars deeper with each passing decade. Legends say the cabin became less a home than a mausoleum. Smoke-stained walls sagged, air heavy with mildew, portraits of forefathers watching silently as descendants withered under the weight of unnatural inheritance. What began as horror hardened into routine. Sons no longer fought against it. They carried out rituals as though ordained, convincing themselves this arrangement was destiny, while their blood quietly corroded with every generation. Some descendants wandered into towns, their eyes vacant, their speech broken. Men pitied them, but fear outweighed compassion. No one offered shelter. They were turned away, cursed to carry silence into exile. Others simply vanished. The woods swallowed them whole. Hunters swore they saw boys in ragged clothes stumbling through underbrush, but no one investigated. Disappearance had become as ordinary as birth in that cursed line. Over time, whispers claimed the descendants lived in hollows further hidden. Their faces mirrored the same narrow eyes, the same jaws, each generation resembling ghosts of the first sons who had once suffered. The endless chain was not just physical, it was psychological. Raised in captivity, boys grew into men who enforced captivity themselves, believing obedience was protection, that silence was strength, and that chains were sacred. Neighbors continued their silence. They avoided hollows where the descendants lived, muttering prayers when passing. Fear shaped their indifference. The curse endured not because of ghosts, but because of living men unwilling to intervene. The hills themselves became part of the legend. Mist clung to the valleys. Winds carried cries at night. Men whispered that the land remembered, binding the descendants to their forefathers' sins. With each retelling, the story blurred, but the pattern remained unmistakable. Sons became fathers, fathers became tyrants, and brothers became captives. Blood folded inward until lineage was not a tree, but a noose. The curse outlived the cabin. When its roof collapsed and timbers rotted, the story persisted. Men warned their sons not to wander, their voices trembling as though speaking the name might awaken shadows. What terrified men most was not the grotesque details, but the recognition of complicity. They had allowed it. Their silence fed it. And so, the endless chain was theirs as well. Generations later, whispers persisted. Some said the bloodline survived in plain sight, men with eerily similar faces, quiet, withdrawn, carrying shadows in their eyes. Others claimed the chain ended, buried under weeds and stone. But folklore does not die easily. It clings to memory like smoke to rafters. And so the endless chain became more than history. It became a mirror, reflecting the consequences of silence. The story of sons bound as husbands, of children cursed by blood, of neighbors complicit through silence, is not confined to Tennessee. It echoes wherever men let cruelty thrive unchecked, and so the endless chain remains, not of ghosts or curses, but of warnings. A reminder that silence can bind stronger than iron, and that blood twisted by fear can outlive even the men who began it.